Hello, my name is Professor Jules Simner. I'm a neuropsychologist at the University of Sussex in the south of England. And I've spent the last 20 years researching sensory differences, largely focusing on synesthesia. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm going to share my screen with you now and introduce my talk, which is on synesthesia in children. So you may know already that synesthesia is a rare, lifelong neurological condition that causes a consistent kind of merging of the senses. So people with synesthesia experience unusual colours, shapes, smells, textures in response to everyday activities like listening to music. So here is a woman with sound colour synesthesia. She's hearing the sound of the violin and experiencing that sound as colours in her visual field. Now, although we know that synesthesia is rare, it's not really as rare as you might think. So over the last 15, 20 years, I've run a number of prevalence studies on synesthesia. And altogether, I've individually screened over 17,000 people with an objective test for synesthesia. So I'm pretty certain that I have a good idea of the prevalence of synesthesia. And those studies have shown that it's at least 1 in 23 people. So that's around at least 4.4% of the population. Now that sounds rare, but when you scale that up to the population of the planet, that means that there are 307 million synesthetes worldwide. Now that's equivalent to the entire population of North America. Or if you like, in Africa, the 307 million synesthetes worldwide is equivalent to the combined populations of Algeria, Nigeria, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. So it's a rare condition, but not as rare as you might think, and certainly not negligibly rare. Now, over the last 20 years, in the time that I've worked on synesthesia, I've seen the number of papers, science papers written about synesthesia really rapidly increase. This is just a graph from going up to 2012, and you could see that the rise was already underway. But virtually every single one of the papers that have been written about synesthesia have been written about synesthesia in adults. And that means we know virtually nothing at all about synesthesia in children. And that's what this talk is about. So my interest in synesthesia in children dates back around 15 years when I started to receive emails from parents telling me about their child and asking me if their child has synesthesia. Now, back then there was simply no test. So the answer from scientists was, well, I don't know. They might have synesthesia, I really don't know, there's no test. Now, I got really tired of responding like this to parents who would email me, and so I made an application to the European Research Council for funding, for grant funding, and I was awarded 1.3 million euros to run the largest, most comprehensive study on childhood synesthesia to date. And that money was augmented a year ago to add another 150,000 euros to also develop a test for childhood synesthesia. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the focus of that grant and what we learned over the last 5 years. Now, that grant looked at synesthesia in children and it asked, how does it develop? Are there any comorbidities? If you have synesthesia, do you also have other conditions? Does synesthesia give children learning advantages or disadvantages? Are they better or worse than their peers? How can you diagnose synesthesia in children? And how can we support synesthesia in children? So the very first thing we had to do was find a whole bunch of child synesthetes to study. And to do that, we decided to focus in on 2 particular types of synesthesia. So we studied grapheme colour synesthesia. Now, a grapheme is just a letter or number. So children with the grapheme colour synesthesia have colours for the letters of the alphabet or for their numbers. And we know from research from our European colleagues, Romka Rao and her colleagues, we know that this form of synesthesia can be traced back to structural differences in the brain, differences in white matter connectivity. So this was the first form of synesthesia that we focused on. The second form of synesthesia we focused on is called grapheme personality synesthesia. again, triggered by graphemes, triggered by letters and numbers, but instead of causing colour sensations, they give rise to the impression of a personality or gender. So somebody with grapheme personality synesthesia might think that the number 4 is female and short-tempered, that the number 9 is male and old. The number 10 might feel like a motherly female. And just like in grapheme colour synesthesia, we know that this form of synesthesia could be traced back to structural differences in the brain, this time in an area called the corpus callosum, which is differently connected in people with this form of synesthesia. So the very first thing we had to do was find a whole bunch of child synesthetes to study. And in order to do that, we embarked on a really ambitious screening process. We screened thousands and thousands of children from the age of 6 years up to 10 years. And every child was individually assessed for synesthesia, and every now and then we would find a child with synesthesia. So we actually screened over 6,000 children, and you can see them represented here. And among those, we found over 100 children with synesthesia, and they were the participant population in our study. The very first thing this was able to tell us was what is the prevalence of synesthesia in children. And from our numbers, we could see that grapheme colour synesthesia was found in 1.2% of children. And by coincidence, personality synesthesia was also found in around 1.2% of children. And those two populations overlap slightly. So if you have grapheme colour synesthesia, you're also more likely to have the personification synesthesia. But overall, that means that if you take an average-sized primary school in the UK, there will be over 6 synesthetes. There will be at least six synesthetes in that school, statistically speaking, at any given time. And equally in Africa, if you take an average-sized school in South Africa, there will be 9 children with synesthesia, statistically speaking. And that's really surprising, because I think you'd agree that this is a hidden population. Teachers are often completely unaware that there are children with synesthesia in their class, when in fact, statistically speaking, we're pretty certain that they will have numerous synesthetes in their school. So, as well as identifying these child synesthetes, we then gave them a test battery. We tested the children on 24 different tasks. We tested the parents on 5 different tasks. This is just a list of all the tasks we gave, and I would just pluck out some of the more relevant ones through the rest of this talk. I'll tell you about our findings. But in general, we were looking at to see if children with synesthesia were different to other children in their academic profile, their sensory profile, in their memory span, in their well-being or personality, their empathy and their creativity. And really the question we wanted to ask was, what are child synesthetes like in their personalities, in their well-being and in their academic skills? So let's jump straight in. Let's look first of all at the test we gave them for personality. So we gave them the children a personality measure from the Big 5 inventory. And I'll tell you what I mean by Big 5 inventory in just a few moments, but this is what the questionnaire looks like. The children see a preamble sentence that says, I see myself as someone who, and then they get a series of items, a series of adjectives, and they just have to say whether they agree that that adjective is like them or not. So I see myself as someone who is talkative, and they could either strongly disagree, disagree a little, neither agree nor disagree, agree a little, or agree strongly. And that, I think there are 44 different items in that questionnaire. For our very young children, we made it very easy for them to understand this questionnaire. We created a pictorial version. And here, for example, they would see a child who is doing things carefully and completely, and a child who is not doing things carefully and completely. And they would just ask which one is like you, and they would choose the child most like them, and then they would say how much it was like them. And finally, we also administered the parent version of this questionnaire to the children's parents. And this is just the same as before, but this time the parents are rating their child. Now, I talked about these being Big 5 inventory personality questionnaires. So the Big 5 inventory is based on the idea that you can describe somebody's personality according to 5 different traits. You can talk about how conscientious they are, how extroverted they are, how agreeable they are, how neurotic they are, and that really means how anxious and nervous they are, and how open they are to experiences. Now, this last trait here actually means how creative are they and how intellectually curious are they. And this was really where we found the bulk of our differences. We found that children with synesthesia were significantly more open to experiences, more creative, more intellectually curious. It was significant for both our colour synesthetes and our personality synesthetes. We also found that the parents agreed. So especially with our grapheme colour synesthetes, the parents also agreed that their children were higher on the trait of openness to experience. And according to parents, the children with synesthesia, at least with colour synesthesia, were also different on their extroversion. They were significantly less extroverted than other children. Okay, so we then wanted to see whether there were differences in their well-being. So we gave questionnaires for anxiety and mood. So parents saw the screen for child-related anxiety disorders, and this is a questionnaire that conducts anxiety disorder. And the parents completed this about their child, for example, with questions like, my child gets scared when he or she is away from home, and how true is that statement? And then children themselves, we gave them a mood questionnaire, and we said, in the last week, rate how much have you been sad, happy, scared, miserable, cheerful, proud, afraid, joyful, mad, or lively. And they rated each one of those adjectives for how they had felt in the last week. And we found that both of these measures showed differences for our children with synesthesia. Now, bear in mind that our parents do not know that their children are the ones with synesthesia at this point, and our children also do not know that they're different to anybody else. So this is not a kind of response bias, okay? But we were genuinely finding differences in the well-being of children with synesthesia. They had significantly greater anxiety disorder. So if you look at the questionnaire and pass over a certain threshold, you enter what becomes a clinically relevant state of anxiety, and it's suggestive of anxiety disorder. Now, that's true of around 10 to 15% of children, but was twice as likely in our synesthetes. So a full 30% of our children with synesthesia passed the threshold of anxiety disorder. They also had an unusual profile in that their moods were muted. So they were less joyous than the average child. So they were less happy, but they were also less sad. So their moods were kind of squashed into this middle ground of kind of neither extremely happy nor extremely sad. And that made them significantly different to their peers. We also wanted to know whether children with synesthesia had sensory sensitivities. Were they overly sensitive to the outside world? Because we know this is true for adults with synesthesia. We know that adults with synesthesia find bright lights too glaring, loud noises too loud, and so on. And we gave a questionnaire for the parents to describe their children. This was the Glasgow Sensory Questionnaire for children. And we found a suggestion that synesthetes probably do have more hypersensitivities than other children. And this was the p-value here was 0.07. So we're not entirely certain, but it's certainly pointing in that direction. And that was true for the children with coloured synesthesia. So let's turn now to their academic skills, because we've seen they have poorer well-being and differences in personality, but academically speaking, children with synesthesia are doing exceptionally well. They have better vocabulary than their peers and better number skills. So we gave them a test to check their receptive vocabulary. How well do they understand words? And in this test here, children see 4 objects pictured on a screen, and they're given one vocabulary item. Here the item was rodent, and they're told to point to the rodent. And if they correctly point to number 3, this tells us that they know that vocabulary item. And the items get harder and harder and harder. And this gives us a score. And we found that children with synesthesia were significantly better. They understood significantly more words than the average child. And this was also true in terms of their production of vocabulary. They also used sort of more difficult words than their peers, if you like. They used a better vocabulary than their peers. So in the producing vocabulary test, they were shown a definition and a photograph, and they had to produce the vocabulary item. So here, fertile place in a desert, the answer here is an oasis. Okay? And we found that children with synesthesia were also significantly better than their peers in this domain as well. We also found they had better number skills. So we gave them a test of numerosity, which is kind of like your number gut. Now, in this test here, children are shown on screen a set of black dots and white dots, and they only see it flash up for a couple of seconds. And their task is to say, were there more black dots or were there more white dots? And if I let you see this task, it goes something like this. Okay. And we found that as the number of dots increased, synesthetes were keeping up really well, and they had significantly better numerosity compared to their peers. And that was true for both colour synesthetes and personality synesthetes. They also had a better memory span. So when we asked children to repeat a series of numbers, like repeat after me, 371592, and then the children would repeat it back. In this task here, the numbers are getting more and more numbers in a single span, and children with synesthesia were able to keep up really well, and they had a significantly longer number span, better memory span than their peers. And they were also better in their spatial skills. So in this task here, children are shown a picture and they're asked to copy the pattern using the blocks provided. And the pattern gets more and more difficult. And children with synesthesia were significantly better at copying those patterns compared to children without synesthesia, showing they had a better spatial skills. And that was true of both kinds of synesthesia. So overall, for the question of what child synesthetes are like in their personalities, they are open to experiences, so more creative and intellectually curious, but they're also less extrovert. They're more introverted. They're also higher and more likely to have anxiety disorder, rather, and their moods are somewhat muted. But academically speaking, they're superstars in terms of their vocabulary and their numbers skills and their memory and their spatial skills. So I'm going to end the talk by just returning to this question, which is really the question that I was asked most often by parents. What should I do if my child has synesthesia? So what we've done in response to this is create the Multisense Toolkit, which is an online information hub funded by the ERC that provides a whole host of information and fact sheets and support for all kinds of people who might come across children with synesthesia. So if you're a parent, you can follow the parent link and download a fact sheet about synesthesia and tailor it to your child, and then you can pass that to the teacher, and the teacher can go online and look at our resources and so on. And you can see various pages in there, all kinds of options for information that it shares. And we've also been funded to create a diagnostic for childhood synesthesia, which looks something like this. So one thing we know about synesthetes is they're very consistent when they tell us their colours for letters and numbers. So if their letter N is red, for example, it will always be red. It won't flip-flop from day to day. It will constantly be red. And we can measure that consistency in a test and use it to identify the children with synesthesia. So in the test here, the child sees a letter or a number in the corner of the screen and uses this colour palette to pick the colour that they want to associate with that number. And then they move on to the next letter and the next letter and the next letter. And when they finally get to the end of the alphabet, they're given a surprise retest. So they end up seeing every letter and number twice. And what we can do then is compare the colour they gave first time round to the colour they gave second time round. So this is a typical child, and the typical child is not very consistent at all. The first time they saw A, they said it was green, and the second time they said it was red. But a child with synesthesia is very consistent. They will always pick the same colour when shown the same letter or number. And we can quantify this difference numerically to give us a score in this test and to show us a diagnostic threshold for synesthesia. And we have a test like this for graph and colour synesthesia, and we also have a similar test for the personality synesthesia. So in summary, we've been able to work out a bit more about what children with synesthesia are like, and we know they have differences in their personality. Their well-being is poorer, but their academic skills are higher. We're able to recognise synesthesia with a diagnostic test that we're hoping to roll out within a year. And we now have the Synesthesia Toolkit, which is a kind of information hub online that provides resources for children and parents and teachers about childhood synesthesia. And I just want to thank all of these people who were involved in this research, and thank also my funders. And I'm going to stop my talk there and end the recording now. Thank you very much for listening.